Okay, I think we can get started. Good morning, everyone. Happy 4th. Welcome to July Pride Forum, the July Pride Forum series. Today, we will be hearing from our guest speakers from Lambda Archives of San Diego. But before we begin, let's start with a prayer. O source of life, you have blessed each of us with your spirit. In your wisdom, you have made each of us a unique treasure. Wellspring of our lives, cause us to flow with courage, strength, and compassion to live our stories openly, proudly, and joyfully. Presence of love, you embrace us with your love. May we embrace ourselves, our partners, our lovers, our friends, our children, our dear ones, with the power of your unending, boundless love. Spirit of peace and wholeness, open our eyes to the gifts and blessings we offer and receive from each other. Open our hearts to welcome each other fully and truly. Open our hands to embrace, to support, to lift each other with joy, with song, with peace, and with deep friendship. Today, as we celebrate pride and community, let us walk together with strength, compassion, and love. Amen. And now I will turn it over to Susan Jester, who will introduce our guest speakers for today. Susan?
Good morning, everyone. I'm very delighted and happy to introduce my friend, Nicole Verdes, and new friend, Gabrielle, from Lambda Archives this morning. Gabrielle uses the pronouns they, he, she. Gabrielle is a project assistant at Lambda Archives and the exhibition content development intern at the LGBTQ Religious Network. They are an artist and designer, aspiring archivist, and a 2019 graduate from Scripps College with a BA in Media Studies and 2 minors in Art and Feminist, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. She is interested in the intersection of art, media, and film, publishing, archives, and the LGBTQ community. In the fall, they will be applying to Masters of Library and Information Science programs. I think they will be very busy. And my friend Nicole, who by a happenstance of the universe, I learned that her stepfather and I are high school graduates together from Palm Springs High School. So I'm delighted that you're here, Nicole, and thank you so much. Nicole is the current board president of Lambda Archives. In her time volunteering with Lambda Archives, she has been successful in using her social justice, arts and culture and cultural policies that center equity and access to the community archives. In addition to her role at Lambda Archives, she served on the executive committee of San Diego LGBT Community Center, Young Professionals. It's the board president, treasurer for Volunteer with Chelly, and a member of the steering committee for Rising Art Leaders San Diego, and has served on a grant panel for the California Arts Council. So without further ado, my friends and colleagues from Lambda Archives.
So much, Susan. Great introduction. So yes, I am Nicole Verdes. I'm the board president of Lambda Archives, and Gabrielle and I are gonna talk a little bit today about Lambda, a little bit about the history of Stonewall, of our local pride here, and then I will hand it over to Gabrielle to have them talk about some of the amazing work that they're doing in our archives and at their internship with the LGBTQ plus religious network archives. So Gabrielle, can you hit the next slide?
Mhm.
So for those of you that don't know, and many of you might, Lambda Archives is the local community archives, and our mission statement is to collect, preserve, and share the local LGBTQ plus history of San Diego, Northern Baja California, and Imperial County region. Next slide. So Lambda was established in 1987 by Jess Jessup and others as a response to the AIDS crisis. I was very intentional when I chose this picture of Jess with his cat, because although I never had the opportunity to meet him, and he had passed away in 1990, unfortunately, one of the things that I always hear about Jess is that he was a fierce activist, but he was also a very gentle-hearted person. And he believed that you didn't need to be loud and you know, this huge personality to make an effect change. So I love this picture of him with his cat. When you think of 1987, which is when the archives was founded, you know, that was a devastating time because of the AIDS crisis. And the archives really started in response to an urgent sense in the community that, you know, people were dying. We were losing people at staggering rates, and starting this community archive was a way to preserve the history of people in our community and to share it with others in the future. Next slide. Also, kind of a fun fact for those that don't know, we are located at 4545 Park Boulevard, and we share the same building as Diversionary Theater, which is the third oldest LGBT theater in the country. The building was originally home to Fritz Klein, who was an Austrian-born American psychiatrist and sex researcher who studied bisexuals and their relationships. He was an author and an editor, as well as the developer of the Klein Sexual Orientation Grid. Similar to the Kinsey scale, for those that are familiar with that, he made a grid similar to that that measured an individual's sexual orientation. He was a staunch supporter of Diversionary and of Lambda, of the arts in general. And he used to work in the building with his practice, which is actually how Lambda came to be in this building. So next slide.
Sorry.
No worries. So during the pandemic, you know, obviously, like a lot of other organizations, especially nonprofit organizations, you know, we had to weather the storm of COVID and had to pivot quite a bit of what we were doing in the archives in response to COVID. But we did hire our first ever full-time employee, who is our new head archivist, Joyce Gabrielle. We also hired 3 part-time employees as a result of grant funding that we received from the California State Library, and Gabrielle, who will be talking in a few minutes, is one of those amazing project assistants. So here they all are. Aren't they cute? Great. I love these people. So we're having fun at the archives. We have a full house now. It's been an interesting year because of the pandemic, but we're really happy to be growing our organization and moving it in an exciting new direction. So I'm gonna shift and talk a little bit about the Stonewall Rebellion. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard about Stonewall. The Stonewall riots, also called the Stonewall uprising, began in the early hours of June 28th, 1969, when New York City police raided the Stonewall Inn, which was a gay club, still is a gay club, located in Greenwich Village, New York City. The raid sparked a riot among bar patrons and neighborhood residents as police roughly hauled employees and patrons out of the bar, leading to 6 days of protests and violent clashes with law enforcement outside the bar on Christopher Street, in neighboring streets, and in nearby Christopher Park. So the Stonewall riots are often seen as the catalyst for the modern, what we would consider the modern LGBT and or gay rights movement in the United States and around the world. Next slide. And so under the direction of President Obama, the Stonewall National Monument was established at the site in 2016. I've been fortunate enough to visit the Stonewall Inn a few times. It's a great place to visit. If you haven't, I highly recommend. An estimated 5 million participants commemorated the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising, and on June 6, 2019, New York City Police Commissioner James P. O'Neill rendered a formal apology for the actions of officers at Stonewall in 1969. So our local pride here, San Diego Pride, and these are some images from Pride's past, formed in 1974 as a sponsored program of the center, the LGBT Community Center here in San Diego. San Diego Pride produced the first lesbian and gay parade in San Diego to celebrate the 1969 Stonewall Rebellion in New York's Christopher Street. San Diego Pride formally incorporated as a 501c3, a nonprofit, in 1994. Next slide. I'm sure a lot of you remember our former mayor, Roger Hedgecock. The year that San Diego Pride formally incorporated, he organized a group of protesters calling themselves, quote, the normal people, unquote. They actually formally applied to march in the Pride Parade to, quote, in political disagreement to the homosexual agenda, end quote. When rejected by the organizers of the parade, Hedgecock filed a lawsuit arguing that their exclusion violated San Diego's human dignity ordinance. The Superior Court rejected their claim, arguing that their right to march was not protected under the ordinance, since the parade was a private event and the normal people message was intended to interfere with the event. And this is just a stock image I found online, which I thought was kind of funny. It makes him look particularly evil. But then there's this direct quote from him saying, "We are looking for 10,000 people to completely dwarf this so-called Pride Parade. What is there to be proud of anyway? That they've perpetrated the most devastating plague since the Black Death in the 16th century." So obviously, you know, San Diego came a long way by incorporating San Diego Pride as an actual nonprofit, but that same year, you know, they were still up against this type of rhetoric and opposition. Next slide. So I wanted to kind of tie Stonewall and our local pride here together by talking about the way that people often remember things differently in history. And that's kind of an interesting thing that we deal with as the local community archive. And here I have pictured up at the top, Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, who were no doubt instrumental during the Stonewall uprising and during and throughout the queer and I would say trans and LGBT movement. And then below here, I have a picture of butch lesbian Stormy Delavarre, who oftentimes there's this talk in the community about who threw the first brick at Stonewall, you know, who you know, kind of instigated the uprising. And there's always, you know, this back and forth about who started it, you know, and who's responsible and who gets credit and that kind of thing. And then Gabrielle, next slide.
Oh, I think it was just my section that started.
Oh, it's okay. I can talk a little bit about it too. So here in San Diego, you know, there are technically there are no articles, photos, et cetera, to show that the first Pride March took place in 1974, but some local activists believe that it did, say that they were there. Technically 1975 was the first year that there was a permit for the march. And the reason I talk about those two things, the thing with the first brick at Stonewall and the you know, hotly contested when did the first San Diego Pride start, is I just think it's interesting to note that sometimes people, you know, remember things differently. Sometimes people in the community latch on to different facts, you know, differently depending on what their personal, I don't know, whether it's their memory, whether it's just what, you know, folks want to believe, that kind of thing. And, you know, Gabrielle and I were talking about this the other day, that, you know, people place a lot of weight on, well, who was the first, you know, And we see it all the time at Lambda. Well, I was the first and this person was the first to do this, that, or the other thing. And certainly those kinds of facts are significant, but just an interesting note that sometimes, you know, it's interesting to point out that there's this great deal of importance placed on the first person to do this, that, or the other, the first year that this event was held or not. So anyways, just something interesting to mention. But with that, I'm now going to turn it over to Gabrielle to talk a little bit about their work at Lambda and beyond.
Awesome. I'm just gonna try to reload this real quick because for some reason, some of my images aren't loading. I just refreshed the page. Oh no, I lost it. Apologies for the technical difficulties here.
No worries.
No worries.
But yeah, just to kind of get started, my name is Gabrielle. I use they, he, and she pronouns. I started working with Lambda Archives in November of 2020, after a very long and difficult summer of in between employment. And so I'm a project assistant working on the California State Library grant funded project that we're doing at Lambda. And that mostly involves kind of digitizing our larger flat file collection. So a lot of like our poster objects and other kind of large paper items such as protest signs and other things of that nature. And the project also includes making those files accessible online, as well as doing the metadata creation for those objects. And another component of the project is processing some of our unprocessed or kind of less processed collections at the archives themselves, trying to focus on Black, Indigenous, and other people of color collections, as well as just generally more underserved and under-recognized collection creators. Oops, too far. Oh, boy. And so also doing that collection processing involves creating finding aids for each of those collections. So helping kind of allow users to view the contents of what's in the collection organized by folder type and other series. So this helps increase the accessibility of our collections because we have so many and there's so many different materials in each one. So it's a helpful navigation tool for people and researchers or community members to use to gain access to certain objects. And then another kind of component of my work has been doing some blog writing. So a couple of my blog posts are available on our website, usually taking a critical and analytical lens to the materials themselves, as well as the process of archiving. So one of my most recent ones that were published was about the 1975 San Diego Pride, actually 1976, and the kind of like controversy over that in regard to the inclusion of the Socialist Workers' Party and the depoliticization of Pride. So there's a variety of those up right now. And then another project that I've been working on with the other project assistant, Ethan, is we're doing a timeline about Black, Indigenous, and other people of color led LGBTQ organizations throughout the years. So trying to compile that information into one place in order to highlight these under-recognized and very important groups that are all like, they all influence each other, are all connected to each other. The history kind of one leads into another. So that's also been a very rewarding project as well. And then something that I'm planning to do throughout the scope of my time with Lambda is to create a digital exhibition kind of discussing the kind of similarities and overlaps between the HIV and AIDS kind of core epidemic in the 80s and 90s and the activism surrounding that in LGBTQ communities, and how that kind of overlaps with our present COVID pandemic and the crisis that has emerged from that, and kind of what lessons have overlapped and what organizing strategies have overlapped. So that's kind of something I'm planning on working on as well. And then I'm currently doing a summer internship with the LGBTQ Religious Archives Network, which is an all digital project that's mostly volunteer run, very part-time staff. And it kind of works to bring together different repositories and materials and kind of help people aggregate it all together so it's more searchable and accessible. And so I'm doing, I'm the exhibition content development intern. So I'm helping to migrate some of the old digital exhibitions that have been made into a newer platform called Omeka, which is kind of like a open source exhibition platform that's available to archives, libraries, museums, etc. And so presently I'm working on migrating a digital exhibition on the Council on Religion and the Homosexual. So that's actually very exciting. I originally was doing an exhibition about the congregation Beit Simcha Torah, which is the first LGBTQ Jewish congregation in New York, but needed to kind of do a pivot due to some technical and organizational difficulties. So that had to be changed. So in the process of migrating these exhibitions, I get to optimize a lot of the exhibition files. So making scans of text documents accessible and searchable for people. So folks are able to really pinpoint kind of what they're looking for, which is really great. And then kind of two other tasks that I've been doing is I've been transcribing a conference sessions. So in 2017, LGBTQ ran, helped organize this event called Rolling the Stone Away, which was a conference to gather LGBTQ religious leaders and activists and things like that. And so the session that I've been transcribing that I just finished, which was great, was specifically about HIV and AIDS and people who are involved during that time from a religious perspective, which I thought was actually like incredibly unique and compelling and just very intimate and like emotional. And I thought it was one of the most like rewarding parts of my internship so far, is like being able to really engage with that time period in a new lens for me personally. So that was definitely something really great. And then another component of my internship is writing biographical profiles. So both for folks who have since passed, as well as kind of current living LGBTQ leaders, activists, and other folks. So I'll be writing a biographical profile on Polly Murray, who was an Episcopalian priest later in her life, and she's very prolific for her work in Brown versus Board of Education, a lot of legal work that she did earlier in life. And then I'll also be interviewing some folks just via Zoom, different religious leaders there. And yeah, I wanted to also show some of the kind of great photography we have available on our Flickr account that is open and accessible for everyone to look at, kind of highlighting some of the beautiful overlaps between religion and LGBTQ pride specifically. So a lot of these photos will kind of highlight Dignity San Diego, as well as the Metropolitan Community Church and the kind of history that's there with them. So yeah, this first one is Dignity San Diego at Pride in either the late 80s, early 90s. I just kind of love the simplicity, but also the power that comes from a lot of the messaging that these folks are putting out. And like, to me, seeing like how early that this was happening, like, you know, I was born in 97, so obviously anything before that's early for me, but I think it's helping me kind of reshape how I view the connections between religion and LGBTQ history and activism. So I think these are some of the coolest photos. So yeah, 2007 Pride, 1998 Pride, 1994. And it's like, they've been there for every Pride. It's really beautiful to see that consistency and really like the commitment. And so I also wanted to include some other photos of Dignity, not at Pride, but just kind of like where they were holding their services and the devotion around that and the commitment to like having their own space. So I thought that was really beautiful.
Yeah, and then for those that don't know, Dignity USA is an organization with headquarters in Boston that focuses on LGBT rights and the Catholic Church. And then MCC, the Metropolitan Community Church, is an international Protestant Christian denomination. There are 222 member congregations in 37 countries. And we have one here in San Diego. Sorry, Gabrielle, just wanted to.
Yeah, no worries. And then one of the last images I wanted to highlight is actually this AIDS memorial at one of the prides in the late 80s, early 90s that I think was maybe kind of co-organized by Dignity, and really wanting to kind of stress that, you know, while Pride is supposed to honor, you know, the uprisings of Stonewall and the kind of the joyful life of like being an LGBTQ person, it's also like important that we like honor and respect like those that we've lost in that process, especially those that we've lost during the HIV and AIDS crisis. And especially with more recent Pride, sometimes that gets lost in kind of the corporatization and other kind of like depoliticized versions of what Pride has become in a lot of different places, because the lessons and the memory and just of AIDS and HIV organizing is so important for our present moment. I mean, the slogan, you know, healthcare is a right, that emerged out of ACT UP's organizing during the 80s and 90s, which was a group organizing for folks who have HIV and AIDS to gain access to different resources and to politically like protest against folks that were either promoting harmful messaging or not paying attention to the issue. So I think that like that's something I wanted to stress, that like healthcare, you know, healthcare is a right, and it's still something that people don't have access to in the present. We've seen with how COVID has emerged, really the devastation of that consequence and like how little things have really evolved since that time. So I think it's always important to kind of keep these lessons in mind and continue to honor that memory and that legacy of activism and community. So yeah, those are all our links and where you can find us.
Awesome, thanks, Gabrielle. I think we are going to open it up for questions. If anybody has questions, comments, we're happy to take those.
Thank you both so very much. I have a ton of questions, but I will let people who are in the hall step up to the microphone first before if anybody has questions, before I launch into mine. Okay. So my first question is, are you open to the public currently, or are you still closed for pandemic reasons?
Great question. We're technically not open to the public, but it's not entirely pandemic related. Earlier this year, Diversionary Theater launched a large scale reconstruction on the building. Mm-hmm. So that's going on, and that's actually the kind of, I don't want to say it was good timing, but you know, we were close to the public anyways, and so was Diversionary, obviously. So this plan to move forward with construction has been going on for the past couple months and should be completed in August. Okay. So to answer your question, we're not open yet, but once the construction is done, we will be.
And do you have revolving kinds of exhibitions in your space?
We will, and we have in the past. We just don't right now because we're kind of reorganizing what we're doing with the space during the construction. Part of what we're doing, or part of what Diversionary is doing, is they're putting an education center on the second floor that will be shared by Diversionary and Lambda. That space, part of that space up there used to be our storage. So we've now had to kind of pivot and move things around a little bit. So our exhibit space isn't live right now, if you want to put it that way. But yes, in the past we have, and will continue to have kind of a revolving exhibit in the exhibit space.
Is this mic still on? Oh, I wanted to ask, I've talked to some old timers, almost as old as me, who 1974, I believe, the march was not authorized. It was turned down by police or mayor or both. And they marched, I am told, with some of them with paper bags on their head. Do you people have any data on that first illegal march?
I can answer that unless Gabrielle, have you come across those photos? I've seen them.
Yeah, I've seen kind of, I'm not sure in 1974 specifically, but I've seen that paper bag kind of imagery repeated at several prides. And I think it has a lot to do with kind of like personal safety and not wanting your identity exposed by accident. So people's livelihoods and jobs could be jeopardized if they were outed in that process of, attending a LGBTQ pride event, having that kind of automatically associated with you being a member of that community. And, in the 70s, that was definitely an endangerment to your livelihood, as well as like personal relationships, depending on what community you're in.
Thank you.
How do you decide what goes into the archives?
Gabrielle, do you want to take that?
That's a great question. I think that's something that our head archivist, Joyce, is actually kind of reformulating right now. So kind of in the past, because we've been mostly a volunteer run space for so long, is that we would kind of take in whatever anyone would give us or what we would find. But we're, I think, really now starting to hit a point where, due to space limitations, as well as just trying to honor the original mission of the archives, is to really kind of now start to filter our appraisal process a bit more in terms of what can we take, what do we have space for, what can we address in terms of like preservation needs and digitization needs and things like that. So I think oftentimes something that we've run into that we're going to try to really address is like having too many duplicates of the same object, or having objects that are almost so generic in their origins. So something like a really standard, rainbow pride flag from, some event that doesn't have any additional kind of meaningful information like in it itself. So yeah, trying to really, make sure that like the duplicate amount is smaller, as well as to, kind of eliminate any of these more generic things, like trying to find objects that really have like unique historical value and aren't something that we already have in our collection. So I imagine our archivist Joyce is really trying to put together a more coherent policy guideline about that, but that's my sense, at least, kind of having been here so far.
I have a question or a comment. I just wanted to point out the reason for the paper bags and any other attempts at anonymity was because it was against the law to be a homosexual in California until 1976, really. So you could not only lose your job or whatever other benefits in life, but you could also go to jail and serve time. It was a criminal offense. So that was the purpose for the anonymity in that first protest march.
Thank you, Susan. That's, yeah. I mean, like I said earlier, I've seen the photos, and they, meaning the folks that march with paper bags over their head, have been dubbed the paper bag brigade. But yeah, that is a very important point to point out.
Morning. Thank you. I want to thank you for your presentation and the work that you're doing. It seems the farther we get away from Stonewall and the past, the more important in a way it is to have something to keep it in our memories. And especially I was thinking for younger people. I noticed that you guys are pretty young, and we have a granddaughter who's a lesbian, and I'm thinking of her and wondering how connected she might feel to the beginnings of this, with Stonewall and stuff, and thinking that it's important to know where you came from. where your history comes from. And so I just want to thank you.
No, I appreciate that. One of the things that I've been volunteering for the archives for over 6 years now, and one of the things that has made me stick there is it's really the things in our collection, they're so deeply personal to people. And it's really powerful. It's, I'm almost getting like choked up thinking about it, but there are so many things in our collection that mean so much to people. And even going back to, the way that people remember certain things, I think that, things are so interwoven to how, we experience things personally, the emotions we have tied to them, and things like that. I don't know. I just think the work that Lambda is doing is just so unbelievably important. It's critical. And, I'm so proud of Gabrielle. I'm so proud to be a part of this organization. I'm really thankful that you all asked us to be here today. But yeah, thanks for acknowledging that it is critical work that we're doing by collecting, preserving, and sharing the local LGBTQ plus history, for sure.
Yeah, just to add on to that, like I'm currently only 24, and I was born and raised in South Florida, where I really didn't have really any exposure to LGBTQ history kind of growing up and entering kind of these critical years where I was, really trying to evaluate myself and kind of where I belonged in the community. And, having moved to California back in 2012 and now kind of having this opportunity, I had volunteered with Lambda back in 2019 before I became an employee now. And there's something so like deeply beautiful and rewarding and like really gives you a sense of like place and position as seeing yourself within this larger legacy of the queer community in general. And it's been such an important thing for me, like, as someone who might feel a bit more disconnected from my own family heritage, coming from a Cuban and Jewish background, and like having different connections there, but being able to find connection in this larger kind of community history and community legacy is it really helps create this sense of belonging and this sense of like, oh, like there's been so many people before me, like this isn't, it's not new, it's not like, I don't know, I just think that's so beautiful to like, after years of hearing, very negative messaging about the community and being like, yeah, no, we've been here and we've been doing all this incredible work. Like, I love seeing all these photos from like around the year of my birth or like even before. And I'm like, that's so cool. Like, I couldn't even conceptualize that as a child, like, and I think it's so important for younger folks, like your granddaughter, like have access to these materials, because like what I would have done to like have had that growing up, like I want to impart that upon like younger generations. I feel like a lot of folks in the community share like similar sentiments about that, like trying to give others what you yourself were not able to access growing up. So yeah, it's vital work, and honestly, it at like the bottom line, it does actually help like save lives, for like youth, LGBTQ youth who are alienated from their communities or wherever they might be. Like, this stuff is so meaningful and so really life-saving at the end of the day.
And one of the things that our new head archivist, Joyce, is really passionate about is connecting the generations. Everybody in the community has value and something to bring to our history. There are folks like Susan that, have been doing amazing work for literally decades, that can, you just saw it today, step up to the mic and kind of add to the discussion. And then you have people like Gabrielle, who was born the year after I graduated high school, which is completely bananas to me, but and everybody, brings something of value. And Joyce is really, working towards connecting the generations, which I also think is really important work. And I'm really excited to see how that develops.
I had two questions. One, I wanted to share a question that someone asked me, and where does Lambda come from and what does the name mean? The second question is, how does Lambda organize or coordinate with other LGBTQ plus archives that might be around the rest of the nation, or is there any coordination? Thanks.
Gabrielle, do you want me to take that?
I actually have another question. Sorry, I have one comment and then I do have a question. So I am from New York City. I did live in Greenwich Village for 16 years. I know where Stonewall is. And in one of the photos, Nicole, you had a picture, I forget who is standing in front of the cubbyhole, but I have been to the cubbyhole and it is still there. My question is, do you have any type of LGBTQ narrative project where you're interviewing people to preserve the life histories of the community in San Diego?
That's a great question. We do have a really robust oral history collection. You can actually, if you even Google Lambda Archives oral history, find, you know, several. I don't know how many we have, but it's quite a few. And some of them, the older ones, are just audio. And then some of, as you can see, as we're getting into like the 90s, they're video. So yes, we have several. And we actually recently partnered with some local coalitions, the Black LGBT Coalition, the Latinx Coalition, and Capimeda, to have them do their own oral history project to hopefully eventually keep in our archive as well.
Great, thank
And
you.
Nicole, do you want to address the other gentleman's questions from before about why the name Lambda and kind of where that comes from?
Yes. So the Lambda is actually, it's a Greek letter, but is also used as a gay symbol on the basis of a myth in ancient Greece. So it's not unusual to, you know, you have Lambda Archives, you also have like Lambda Legal. It's a common name attached to a lot of organizations and to our movement. In terms of partnering with other, what I would consider almost like sister archives or working in outreach with other archives, we definitely do. We actually last year signed on to a document with other archives across the world to influence French government to create an LGBT archive in Paris. So it's not only here in the United States, but as far reaching as, you know, other countries. And then we have, you know, of course, One Archives in Los Angeles, which is just fabulous. And they have a huge collection there. The Mazer Archives in LA, which has a large lesbian history collection. So definitely, I mean, it's, you know, people that are interested in archives, you know, they kind of find their way throughout different archives. I'm that way, you know, I tend to kind of like search other queer archives and LGBT archives. So certainly we have and will continue to work with and outreach to other LGBT archives.
What's that? Okay. Across the years, a number of groups represented the first time that people in that group stepped out as homosexual. I'm thinking particularly of teachers marched as a group acknowledging that they were teachers, and police officers and people in the military, all of whom did it in a period of time when doing it was risky. And the fact that you incorporate that in your archive is so meaningful to those of us who did it. And allowing it to be seen by those who are younger than we are and have lived in a time when stepping out and being known as homosexual isn't particularly dangerous anymore, except within family clusters, where acknowledging one's homosexuality may well mean that you are ostracized from your family. So I think the archive has value in that way, by acknowledging firsts and by acknowledging the ways in which people who lost their families were able to cope. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think like Gabrielle hit the nail on the head earlier. The work we do can literally save lives. You know, I think that that's, you know, part of what makes the work so important is that, you know, you can trace back, younger generations can look back and connect and see that, you know, all the work that has been done to pave the way to get to where we are today. And obviously we always have such a far, far way to go. But just seeing yourself reflected in the stories from those that came before you, there's something really powerful about that. And there's something really comforting about that, you know? So I think Gabrielle said it best. And I don't think it's melodramatic at all. It's, you know, it can save lives.
Yeah, and I just think, you know, it's so important to really acknowledge like the courage that it took to do that, to really, you know, despite the danger and the consequences that could come from that act of saying like, yeah, you know, like I'm a gay teacher, and like just there's been so, like I've seen in like photos, you know, from different Pride events, like the backlash that like teachers were getting with different legislation that was getting kind of promoted and pushed up in terms of, you know, people not wanting to have gay teachers with their kids or whatever. But yeah, I think really like honoring and acknowledging that, like, yeah, like there was a time where like, again, like as Susan had said, that this was like illegal and like there were pretty devastating consequences for people. So I think allowing like younger folks to really have that full perspective of like, yeah, you know, like this was like, it was illegal. Like there were all these other dangers that like aren't as prominent now. And yeah, I think being able to like honor that, both that sacrifice and that courage is so important, because, you know, if we can't acknowledge that, like how can we kind of continue the work moving forward in terms of where we're going with present organizing, for instance, around trans issues and things like that. So yeah, I really appreciate that comment. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? Okay. Well, Gabrielle and Nicole, I want to thank you both so very much for being here this morning. This was a wonderful conversation and presentation. And next week in the forum, Hillary Whittington will share the powerful story of her and her husband Jeff's emotional choice to embrace their transgender child, and Officer Christine Garcia, who serves openly and proudly as the police department's first transgender officer, will be here. So I hope everyone has a wonderful 4th, and we will see you next week.